The layer of abstraction you're working on is really low level in curating the data sets yourselves and all the infrastructure, the parallel compute. It was really not fit for purpose. You're grappling with sort of very, very, very low level. A lot of times data cleaning, things failing all the time.
Something I'm super curious about, the clients you work with are these Fortune 500 companies, probably federal institutions. They're traditionally very, very slow moving, very, very risk averse. How do you balance that?
There are two things to know. First is there are multiple layers at which one has to think about how you make this work for a particular context or task. We leverage the frontier models, but on top of that, there's the AI application layer. Our belief at AuditBoard, the application layer will be bigger than the infrastructure or model layer.
What do you think about the idea of AI being involved in government and actually making the rules? Is that a potential future? Anton, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm excited for this conversation today for two very specific reasons. One, I don't actually understand too much about what you do and what your company does. I'm looking at your website, doing my research beforehand, and there's an immense amount of acronyms that I want to unpack today. And secondly, you are, out of the people I've spoken to, one of the people with the most experience in machine learning, AI, LLMs. So I want to kind of start there. When I look back at kind of your work history, I see this period of time in 2012 to 2014 where you're working with Bright.com. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what exactly was machine learning at that point. What was the experience and what did that feel and look like?
So just going back to that is one question I did not expect for you to bring up Bright.com. So just starting there. So Bright.com was a two-sided recruitment platform. And so if you go back to that point in time, there's a handful of, say, job boards like, Indeed, Career Builder, Monster. And then there's the other side of it, which is, hey, the hiring, the candidate side of things, right? And so again, that's what job boards are, right? Like these two-sided marketplaces. They're all roughly speaking the same. They had different SEO and like how they got candidates or how they got employers on board. What the idea behind Bright.com was the matching problem was very difficult. So could we set something up where you put a score, a transparent score to expose to recruiters or, employers, and one to candidates to give them some guidance as to what they are doing, right? So for a candidate, it would be, hey, I think I'm a good fit for this job, but they're asking for between 3 and 15 years of experience. Like, I have 4. Am I reaching there? Or I have 12. Am I is this a good fit on the employer side? Because if there's a lot of applicants, right? The internet made applying to jobs very easy. And so the challenge there was you had a lot of candidates. And so, hey, how do you begin prioritizing your time? And so you put that score in the middle, allows that matching to happen, and you see the benefits on both sides of hey, on the candidate side, this is a great fit. Hey, here are my reaches. And on the employer side, here's how I manage my time. And so that one, that was sort of a very interesting period in call it the early or mid AI, depending on sort of where you're coming from, because that was also sort of I'm transitioning a little bit into because that was Bright.com. That particular era in recommendations was actually the SaaS Web 2.0 era of big data. So what happened at that point in time was, hey, the internet had happened. So I think Google existed. You had these platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, where started to get going. And so you had this larger and larger bits of data moving more and more onto the cloud. So the really, really big challenge there was, how do you make sense and how do you process all of that? And so that's sort of the era of big data, the world of, what at that point in time you called data scientist. That function has changed a bit over time, the definition of that. But back then, it's just anyone who worked in data was a data scientist. And so there, what was enabled was the need there was for tools like Hadoop or Spark that was able to process all of those. And the key thing there was how, like the concept from back then was embarrassingly parallel. So you can process a lot of things without mixing things together. So you can just run large counts. You can like count the number of words, the number of times that this word shows up on the internet. Join these pieces of data and then count a trillion records of different kinds in a handful of minutes. But the notion there was like things were embarrassingly parallel, and that was the fundamental thing that allowed these large web platforms to understand sort of the masses of data that their users were generating. So that's actually the same thing that allowed, say, recommendations of like you have a million actually typically in the US you'll have handful of million of job openings at any point in time, and some larger number of workers applying for jobs at that same time. And matching all of those is a large scale problem that this embarrassingly parallel nature of it, as in one job description, one profile or resume, doesn't need to mix with too many other things, but it allows you to make a lot of these matches at scale. And a lot of the recommendations, whether it's at Bright.com or LinkedIn or in the ads world, you were able to do. But again, the challenge there was not, hey, how intelligent is it? But is the raw ability to look at data and make predictions, sort of called it almost in isolation. But it was a simpler and by today's standard, a significantly dumber world. But the challenge was, how do you look at all the stuff that's being generated? How do you process all of that? So that was the first era, or maybe, the first era of big data.
I was wondering if you can kind of paint me a picture of the experience of what it was like to work with that. Because right now, like everyone's understanding of AI is, oh, it's natural language. I speak to ChatGPT or I send a voice note to Perplexity and boom, the results are this. What were your initial experiences? What did the interface look and feel like?
From a person in it, it's actually, well, I'm gonna try to answer that in sort of almost an indirect way.
Okay.
Because at the same time that most of software like big data or those that do recommendations, actually, well, just to give you context here, just one thing that you should remember that people move in waves. And so the bulk of any industry will adopt some set of tools or some pattern of working or approach. And so what I described, using Hadoop, using, Spark, pre-computing, a lot of real-time compute, pre and real-time compute, simple and fast recommendations for ads and other things, which is still really common today, right? We don't use a ton of large language models when you go and on a website and they recommend you ads, because you got to get those ads really quickly, because any millisecond that you lose in serving an ad is lost revenue for the platform. And so, that's what I was describing earlier. At that same time, though, right around sort of the 2013, 2014, was when more of the deep learning, more of the trying to bring in that concept of more complex compute at scale was beginning. So you think about earlier versions of transformers, things like word to vex started started popping up. And so what you began to see at that time was a maturity in sort of that old way of, actually at that time it was still very new, but still an old way, the way we were looking at today, old way of working of, hey, there's certain types of techniques. It's really all about data munging, all about struggling and grappling with large scales of data to do relatively simple things, and to do more complex things where that you see today. That was sort of a dream, right? And so at Bright, this is actually one of the things we experimented at Bright when I was there, and then later on at LinkedIn that we experimented there with quite a bit. But again, the challenge there was that you had to deal with every layer of the stack to make that happen, right? So again, the layer of abstraction you're working on is really low level in curating the data sets yourselves and all the infrastructure. The parallel compute was really not fit for purpose. And so, yeah, you're grappling with sort of very, very, very low level. A lot of times data cleaning, things failing all the time. What you have today is a totally, totally different world in which, if you're familiar, there's this website called Hugging Face. And what that allows you to do is like a lot of these models are really common. Like almost nobody trains their own models from scratch anymore. But what you do is so like you have this community that's built up that whether it's from the labs themselves, from smaller groups, that create a lot of these models that become ready to use. So really, it's a hypothesis or a really reality of more democratization. So really, you're focused on well, either you're at a lab or at some place that cares about sort of a lot of the fundamentals, but in the same way that most application developers don't work at the database layer. They don't build databases, they use them. Most folks who work in AI use this like foundation model layer and they build on top of it. Again, you go back 10, 12 years, you were at them, everyone who worked at it was at the model layer, whether it was simple or complicated.
And that is something I want to tap into a little
Mhm,
bit later in the conversation. This idea
mhm,
of you guys are specifically
mhm.
training your models on GRC data rather than just taking off the shelf LLMs. Is that right?
Um, Not quite, not quite. So this is
Okay.
this is where this is the beauty of the world in which we are in now. Uh, the foundation, or what the labs call frontier models, are phenomenal. Like the amount of to give you a sense of context, like a typical model of that scale that you get from like a GPT-5 or whatnot, gets into the billions of dollars to train and set up. Um, and everyone who's used this technology, like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, it's amazing. It's like it is shocking how good it is. But it does get but it's not like that good. You can't take over your life. You can't automate your life just yet. And so it would be idiotic for a company like an AuditBoard to say, hey, we don't want any of that power that's very cheaply available to us. Yeah, it's just sense of scale and cost here. I gave a talk to our customer base, actually, to a user group a few days ago, where like the value proposition of AI a lot of times is just like people talk about it as like, hey, like in the grand AGI sort of artificial general intelligence, super intelligence way, but and sort of like people argue that oh, we're there's a singularity, humanity's over, and that stuff. Like there are people who are genuinely concerned and working towards safeguards against that. But if we get like a little bit more practical, it's like you don't need all this to do everything for you before it's really compelling. So, for example, there are simple I want to write an email. But how many times have you guys like started writing an email? And you're like you're tired. You have like random notes from different places. And you're like I don't. What's how should I frame this? You can just ask Chat GPT, phrase it in your own voice, make a couple of edits, and just set. That's like really simple. Uh, or like you can look at it's like, hey, what does this dish really mean? When you're looking at a restaurant recommendation, like there are really sort of narrow, more niche, task-specific things that like these things are really good at now. Now, so getting back to AuditBoard, though, what we do is there are multiple layers at which one has to think about how you make this work for a particular context or task or a domain. Like per what I was saying, we leverage the frontier models. But on top of that, there's the AI application layer. And so, and it's our belief at AuditBoard, and also there's actually there's a common VC thesis that the application layer will be bigger than the infrastructure or model layer. But so if you look but what does that application layer really mean? It's making sure that for the task at hand, the right context is available. And that context, in sort of more layman's terms, is just like the data that's relevant. Then there's the other things around hey, what's the prompting that's necessary to get this to the way it is? So in enterprise software, in workflow software, this is critical. And so if you're writing a document, typically an organization or the industry will have standards around it. And you'll have opinions. And for us at AuditBoard, so you take something like policies, which is everyone who's worked at a company understands what a policy is, right? You may have a dozen, you may have a few hundred policies. They need to reflect the reality of processes inside the company. So it's the encoding of that. Now, if you go and you just ask ChatGPT, it would just spit back whatever that sounds pretty good. But if you go into an organization, a company, you probably got to change a bunch of stuff. So like a privacy policy for a manufacturing company is very different from the privacy policies that inside of a social media platform like a Meta or an X or something like that. And so like that, even at that level, context is really important. So at AuditBoard, we have 2,600, 2,700 customers in all different segments, different verticals, different levels of maturity. And so what we do is in that application layer, we can call it agentic, you can call it assistive, but what we do in the back end really, when you just think about prompt libraries, there's for every type of thing, there's a prompt library, there's prompt selection, there's prompt chaining logic, and then there's logic that sort of brings in the context for every one of those things. So again, you take a step back for a user, you're either clicking a single button or you're dragging a bunch of documents like notes or whatever, and stuff just begins to be generated. And hopefully, it will be relevant to you for you to say review, for the way we talk about internally for us in audit and GRC. We don't do anything for you. The human's always fully in control. And so we get you 80, 90% of the way there. It's up to you to review, have a chance to edit, and then accept that into a system of record. And so that's we talk about human amplification of this is just an extension of human intelligence, but really it's about automating the stuff away that's sort of mindless. So you press a button, you get your first draft. So I hope sort of that explains what we're trying to do or what we do, which is very much in that application layer, tons of domain, business, and application logic that enables a user to feel like it's just stuff just happens for you in a transparent fashion.
Recruiters decide what they think of you in about 7 seconds. Guess what you look at first? Your photo. That's not an exaggeration. A Forbes study found that 41% of recruiters admit they judge candidates based on their photo before even reading a resume. So if your headshot looks outdated, blurry, or just kind of fine, it's definitely doing more harm than good. That's why millions of people use Aragon.ai, the world's most popular AI headshot generator. Upload 6 photos of yourself, in a minute you'll get professional headshots that look real. Not over-edited, not AI weird, just you and your best day. You can even customize your photos, change your outfit, hairstyle, pose, background, and more until it feels just right. Companies also use Aragon to give their entire team a consistent polished look for LinkedIn, websites, and press features, all without booking a single photo shoot. Go to Aragon.ai now, update your photo today, and start making a first impression that actually gets you noticed.
I'm assuming this is sort of a self-feeding snowball mechanism, right? Because I see this statistic that you guys work with. Over 50% of Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
So when we're thinking about this application layer, and you're saying an important part of the context is the data that you're getting from these companies. So the more companies you get on board, the better that application layer gets, and the easier it gets to get more customers that it just feeds in. Or am I missing?
Yes and no. Yes, the answer is yes, but not in the way that most people think.
Okay.
Privacy matters. Data governance matters. So we, as a rule, do not, and this is an ironclad rule. Like we don't make exceptions to this. We do not train on customer data. And so like that, because the level, so like, we're enterprise software tools for some of the more sensitive workflows at a company. And, because people will audit anything. And so a lot of times the audit gets into very sensitive areas of the business. We will not train on somebody's data. There's a future potentially where we have, bespoke models for every single client. But even then, right, like there are guardrails that need to be in place for it to work for the enterprises that we serve. Like you get large financial institutions, defense contractors, highly, like sensitive areas. We do not train on their data. What we do have, though, is a highly engaged customer and user base. And so like the approach that we take to like making this good and making it good, the name of the game is just evals. People, which really, like in layman's terms, is like, it's just a bunch of, call them test cases, a library of test cases that ensure that like things are good or things are bad. And the way you do it is there's a synthetic approach where you get most of the scale, where you're using language models to actually judge whether your other language model is good. But then you have the human curated element of yes, like this is a like practitioner said this is good or this is not good. So that's what enables you to say a new model released by the labs saying, hey, can we just launch this? It's for observability and drift. You'll hear terms like that. But really what it is a bunch of test cases that this is good or this is bad. The benefit of having a large engaged customer base with subject matter experts internally, so like half of our public facing staff are former practitioners. So we leverage them quite a bit. And so the benefit of having that is that we just build something, we go ask them, hey, is this right? And you're able to iterate relatively quickly with that customer base. And so like that's how you build that's what enables us to build out sort of like this evaluation or this test library that I just described. Because again, you work with a customer, they see it work or not work in cases with their data. Again, but we don't pull out that data. We don't train on their data. We don't do any of that kind of stuff.
Something I'm super curious about, you're talking about this idea of iterating quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But the clients that you work with are these Fortune 500 companies, probably federal institutions. They're traditionally very, very slow moving, very, very risk averse. How do you balance that?
There are two things to know. First is the part that we have no control over, which is the overarching policies at client institution. We help them along the way to navigate their internal policies and rules and processes. But we don't have much control of that. That said, in a pre-AI world, the most sensitive customers, there's some types of organizations, were the ones who lagged behind. Like I remember I was in a prior experience, we were trying to sell SaaS software to a large West Coast financial institution, and they wanted to buy, and then we got their, I guess, CISO on a call, and he told me, he looked us on the face, and he said, we will never be on the cloud. I know that company, they're on the cloud. But that was 7, 8, 10 years ago. So like they were laggards. Today, though, in this era, if you look at the Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000, who are the ones that are leading, are leading the enterprise adoption of AI? A lot of the times, it is the most previously conservative companies. And all you need to do is just go look at like, what does Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase say about AI? Like these, they're investing as an enterprise-wide strategy in AI development, down actually to fine-tuning, large language models themselves, right? Like, and this, so they're trying to deploy this across their entire enterprise. So it's actually very different now in the sense that what we see, like, again, the basic test is you try to use some of these tools now. Even if they're not quite there, it is not very difficult to see how this is immediately valuable. It can be close to immediately valuable once it improves a little bit, just a little bit, in a handful of different areas, depending on your use case. And so what we're seeing is that. Now, we don't get away from the fact that, hey, if you're a large financial institution, you have a lot of rules. The process of getting a tool approved is still very laborious. But the business is driving it as a requirement for the individual, customer, which is sort of the team that uses it, AuditBoard, to push through that process. So it's still a high friction process. And that high friction process 10 years ago meant like, hey, we don't want to do this. But now the business is pushing it, like the top levels of the business are forcing the teams to go through these processes. And I think that's the big change.
It's not a nice to have, it's a non-negotiable. That risk to reward ratio is way different than what it used to be.
Yeah. So you gotta pay the cost of going through the process. And that's what our customers are getting, well, not demand, but basically directed to do.
I want to go back down to the basics here and talk about AuditBoard as a company and what you do. I log onto your website, and the first thing I see is AI first GRC built for enterprise risk.
Yeah.
I wonder if, in very simple terms, can you break down what governance, what is risk, and what is compliance?
Yeah, so AuditBoard is an audit risk and compliance. So like in risk, so they're all within enterprises. They're risk management functions of different kinds. And so within different parts of risk management, there's this concept called 3 lines of defense. The first line is folks that own the business processes. Basically, the way I think of it is like if you go inside of a company, the person, or if you look at documentation around like, hey, we do this, like here's how we recognize revenue and some sort of like process description. They're the ones who do that. Like that's the first line, your IT team, your sales team, whomever. Then there's a second line, and that's typically risk and compliance teams. What they do, they're the ones that document a lot of these policies, document a lot of these risks. So that's what's called the second line. Okay, policies are typically written by second line functions. So like like the CISO is a lot of times considered a second line function. Compliance is second line function. But they're the ones that are in charge of documenting and a lot of times coming up with the rules in engaging with the first line function, with the business is the way we talk about it with our customers. Audit is, the way I describe it, is like they call it the assurance function or sometimes the advisory functions. But for those that are not from risk management, they're the double checking function. So like there's independent assurance that's internal and external. And so, if you're a public company in the US, listed in the US, you have to go through what's called SOX compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, which is a regulation designed or coming out of like the Enron era, that is designed to protect investors from financial misstatements. And so that's what it's a big part of what AuditBoard does. But that's a compliance / audit team. But the reason why I'm describing it now is an internal team has to go through and do a lot of that work, maintain a lot of the controls that ensure that issues pop up early enough, that can be addressed early enough, that then afterwards an external firm comes in and double checks. So you have actually a multiple layers of checks, especially for things that are more and more important. So again, audit, risk, and compliance, like at a super high level, like they're all risk management functions of different kind. Risk teams think directly about, like risk. Compliance teams think about like, hey, what do we need to be compliant with, whether it's an industry standard or a regulation. And then an audit team is like, okay, what do we need to go and double check that, like, hey, no, we're reporting revenue correctly. Or say some internal audit functions, which is really pure risk, internal risk management, are our privacy settings for a user reflected in all the pages. So that's a check that they can go through independently of, say, an application team that's building that product.
Something I want to frame my next question with is this idea of moving from reactivity to proactivity. I imagine by the time someone brings you in to do an audit and check every system, you can probably find a bunch of problems. Here's what's wrong with this. Here's what's wrong with this. But when I'm looking at what you launched, you just recently launched Accelerate.
Yeah.
And in my mind, that's got the ability to proactively find out issues without having to uncover them in an audit at a later date. Can you tell me a little bit more about what Accelerate does and if I'm kind of on the right track?
Yeah, so Accelerate is a package that encompasses a lot of the new capabilities, especially AI and automations capabilities that we launched at our user conference 2 weeks ago. So that's automations. But to directly answer your question, though, sort of in the framing that you had, we have a thesis around audit risk and compliance and this is a thesis that's been validated with our customers, with understanding the customers and their organizations and their role within the business, that no one has time to do anything today except for the stuff that they absolutely have to do, right? And what I mean, like, absolutely have to do is, so I'll just give you an example of a typical workflow in audit today, which is like, you get a bunch of data out of your ERP and you want to make sure that like the invoices and what's recorded in the ERP line up, right? But you may have like, for big business, you have thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different invoices and different lines, and they're actually manually uploaded one by one through procurement processes that happen throughout the year, or actually sometimes throughout multiple years. That manual double checking there eats up all your time because it's not all standard formats. Just think about like, everyone knows receipts. How many different formats of receipts exist? It's just like, they seem sort of standard, but they're not really. And so like that's where most of our users spend a lot of time doing that kind of checking. But if that's all you're doing, you don't really have time to do much else. You can't be quote unquote proactive. And so you have to be, call it reactive, because hey, you're finding an issue. Because you spent all that time and you finish that thing and you kick it off to somebody else, or in a lot of times you risk accept it because it's small enough. So what we intend to do, and this is sort of, if you look at Accelerate as a package, it is the automation of as much of that as possible. Now, that automation in the AI world means two things. First are like what I call the set it and forget it automations, the stuff that's really repeatable. Potentially you don't need AI to automate that. It could have been automated 10 years ago. And then but that's, and you set it up once, you don't look at it again until there's an issue, and that alerts you. Again, that frees up a lot of your time. Then there's the things that actually you can't actually automate pre-AI. And actually it's sort of, even with AI, sort of difficult enough to fully automate through an agent as it stands today. And so what I'll give you an example. I mentioned privacy, like some of these privacy audits or privacy checks earlier. You think about a large, complex website in which today, because almost everything is on the web, that's a lot of software. It's not just your Facebooks or your Instagrams or your Twitters. It's a lot of different websites. Over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, the application changes so much that any automation that you set up will be obsolete relatively quickly. So the tooling that we then provide for our users is then sort of a co-pilot. It feels agentic in the back end. It may feel agentic because all they're doing is they're clicking a bunch of buttons, maybe redirecting it a little bit. But like that type of automation of a co-pilot works along with you so that when you jump into that situation, all you do is sort of a relatively minor specification redirection of an AI that performs common tasks for you, right? And that common task is not just generating something new, like completing a task. It's also context for you. And what I mean by you here is, I'll give an example. A lot of times, your first job, your second, your first 6 months in a job or in your career, companies or teams just like sort of write that off as onboarding or training. For a lot of functions and for our customers and a lot of their teams, you have this, your first 2 years and then you move up. But for a 2-year stint, if you're like losing 6 months for pure onboarding, that's a lot of efficiency loss. And so even just enabling somebody to have access to easier access to knowledge to know what to do, navigating a complex application, navigating a complex workflow, getting access to an internal manual of some kind is that's sort of that type of enablement is also is part of the assistive experience that we launched a couple weeks ago.
I'm really curious about, so you joined in January of 2024, is that correct?
That's right.
So a year and 10 months ago, 11 months ago now, and I'm curious about what the difference between what your technologies were then, what you were offering on like an AI front then, how that compares to now, and how that will compare to a year and 11 months from now. What is the future?
Well, everything that I just described as, hey, that's what we have now, versus is the difference. Because a year, when I started, there was nothing. And so we didn't have any AI capability. We didn't have any recommendation capability live in the application. We barely had a team. Working on it at the time. We had just the core team that's working on it today was hired right around that time. So over the course of that time, we built up the team. We got to know sort of organization, the industry, and understanding, hey, what does this really mean what does the industry really mean? And how do we enable what are the things we should enable our users with, and your users and our customers? And your next question is actually an interesting one, which is what will things look like in a year and a half, 2 years? The way we talk internally is that everything that we're building is part of a 18 to 24 month journey towards enabling users with more autonomous capabilities. So autonomous agents of different kinds. So the long-term vision for us in the automation side of things is that instead of users in the loop, and what I was describing in terms of that co-pilot was very much a user in the loop doing things. And they get a lot of help. Like ChatGPT is like human in the loop. But what we want to do is move the human over the loop. So you have a long-running, multi-step or long horizon task for a person or for a team, maybe even for an organization. that is completed by agents that are, and so those agents, so like you're orchestrating those different agents. There are probably multiple review points that you have to get into, but you're orchestrating those agents. And what that means is that instead of a user kicking off the next task, an agent is, right? And so, or an AI is. The challenges there are you need the individual components to be there to you want to complete the subtask. You need that component to be good enough. Because the way I describe it is like even if every single task, every single like AI can complete a task 90% successfully every time, all you need is 6 or 7 steps for it to fail most of the time. When I say most, it's like more than 50% of the time it fails. So you only need 6 or 7 of those. And so, like if that happens all the time, you're always going to go back into it. So that's largely the state we're in. However much people talk about like agents and autonomy today, we're not quite there because a human always has to intervene enough of the time. And so that's where like we're still in a human in the loop world, even in an ideal sense. In 2 years, if we're successful, we'll be in a human over the loop where you're orchestrating agents. Then there are additional challenges too, though, that around security, around sort of like the risk that a platform like an AuditBoard, both what a platform like an AuditBoard wants to take on versus what a customer using an AuditBoard would want to take on. And so the way I describe it, sort of the example I use is something like in audit and GRC, there's evidence is a really big thing. So like, hey, how do we know that you don't grant access to everybody? You don't see activity, but like you may give everyone access to like look at customer data, even if no one actually has looked. So typically you'll go into the setting of a certain type of system and then look at the permissions, right? And so like you look at how that system, it could be like Amazon Web Services interface, you're at the IAM interface, or Workday settings page, where you look at that user group, what they have access to. That a lot of times is not available through an API. And so the workflow today is someone takes a screenshot and then uploads it into the system, they annotate it, and they do like, how does that work with autonomous agents? Because we don't necessarily want just an agent made by AuditBoard that can just browse, admin settings in a Workday or another ERP and just upload data. So we have to figure out what are the right guardrails, what is the right enablement for a user, for an organization to be able to get that type of efficiency. Because again, you can just imagine if that's a task that you do every year, every 2 years, like you're not going to remember it, or let's say you never knew how to do this. Like that's a lot of inefficiency that no one really it doesn't really change anything like that. You know how to do that. And so what you want to do is you want to enable an agent to go do that, but in a secure way. What are how we answer that question as a software vendor enabling customers I actually think will be the success or failure of autonomous agents in enterprises.
I'm just trying to abstract this further.
Yeah.
So the reason that we have a human in a loop and we're going to have a human over the loop is because there's in-baked trust. We have an individual, we believe that they have enough knowledge and information, they have the right intentions, and that's why we have them in the loop. Right now, theoretically, agents and AI have the ability to consume and regurgitate way more information than humans ever can. The problem is the in-baked trust. Can we trust their intentions? Are they going to do the right thing that a human would do as well? So
I don't think that's right. I think it's accountability. So yes, it's a trust function. It's a risk management function. But you need to know as a user, the team, the audit team, the compliance team, the risk team is the one that will forever be accountable.
Okay.
The system is not going to be quote unquote accountable. So the user has to trust it enough. They have to be able to verify like the results enough. Yeah, but this is not like an entirely new paradigm, right? Like we use like in in software, right? Like in IT, there's we don't go in and check every single thing, right?
No.
There are standards, there are tests, there are automated tests and monitoring that run that enable us to have confidence that the system tells us that, hey, we're not, we don't have data being exported on a daily basis that's sensitive to someone. Like we have those things in place. When it comes to AI, we need to have the same thing. We need to have it in the workflows. So like in the workflows, that's why I was saying so earlier, but the principle was we do not save anything into a system of record or confirm anything without explicit human opportunity for human to review and edit before finally accepting. And the example I'll give is, it's common to have autosave in a lot of the in a lot of document editor workflows today, experience today. We have that at AuditBoard. For AI generated content, we turn it off. It's like you cannot autosave AI generated content. There's audit logs. With the labs, what they have are, the frontier labs, they have model cards that they publish. So there's an ecosystem of this that is emerging to give users a sense of confidence that this is correct, or sorry, like that this works. Now, that does add pressure for the users to understand how to interpret the results as they come out, especially in the early phases before they've learned how to do so and had the chance to have that type of feedback, whether through a security, like AI security governance and security review process or intake process, or on a more ongoing basis. We don't really know how to do that in the same way that we do for data privacy. Or data privacy may be considered laborious for a lot of people doing it, but the industry as a whole knows how to do that at this point. And we're going to get there with AI. We're going to get there with AI, with agents, with autonomous agents. It's just something that we have to iterate through.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. You talk about AI generated content in there.
Mhm.
How does that fit into the conversation in terms of what you provide and what you do?
So this is all we do. AI generated content. Like,
Okay.
yeah, I'm gonna extract things again. Actually, this is a talk I gave on Tuesday to our user group. What I call in the sort of getting with workflow, all workflow software, whether you're looking at your Oracle workflows, your SAP workflows, Salesforce even. Actually, TurboTax is a good example. That's sort of personal to a lot of people who use, who do taxes. They're all just a bunch of forms strung together and managed. Now, the scale of that can actually be quite complex. So think about like an Amazon that has multiple million employees. They have full-time around the world. So there are different forms for every geography. Every function and type of in what they do is a form, right? So like your Amazon driver that gets paid on hours in the car, they have to clock in and clock out, gets paid very, like the forms that they deal with are very different from the types of forms that a software engineer sitting in Seattle deals with. Okay, but still they're a bunch of forms. And the reason why is enterprise software, the pre-transactional databases in the 80s. The challenge was, how do you have the repeatability, the consistency, collaboration, the scale of managing forms, like those were the problems. And so the transaction database and later on desktop applications and the web like made it possible to do it at say Amazon level or Walmart or so like these large organization level scales. Even websites like a Facebook, like it's largely a bunch of forms and backend. Now, what I'm saying is that like it solved the problem. Generation of content, filling out those forms became the bottleneck, and filling out those forms, filling out the form became the bottleneck. So that's content generation. Now, so like even all the workflows I mentioned to you, you're looking at a bunch of stuff. You fill out the form to fill out the form. Large language models have totally upended that. And so, a GPT-5 or Nano or Mini or like the smaller one, still actually a very good frontier model, is like 40 cents per million tokens. So it's 1,500 pages of text. To get a person to do that, it's 30,000, 200,000, depends on the type of content. Like that's like that 100,000 million time difference is just massive. Now the problem though is that like that's the pure generation part. But what are the requirements? What's the validation? So like the workflow around generating the right thing, getting the human to review and accept that is actually like the key thing. So if because generation of content is just, the cost to generate content now is approaching zero. And so how do you validate? How do you curate? How do you verify that content? How do you align it? How do you set up the requirements for the AI to align to? Like that's the human judgment.
I want to run back into this. I know that we've moved on from this, but just while you're mentioning that, the ability for a human to judge that correctly is only through experience, right? The position we're in right now is the humans that are making these judgments. The only reason that they can make those judgments is because they've done the grunt work for the past 20, 30 years. So with this content now being automated for the most part?
So that is a view. That is a view. But in every single leap in technology, the level of abstraction at which a person operates has gone up. So like even, the most stark example I will give you is the notion of a computer. In 1945, a computer was an individual. Today, a computer is this thing, or this thing that's like right next to us. It's running through the servers. I don't know, like probably like in Virginia or in the UK or outside of London somewhere. That's what a computer is. Now, could you make certain arguments that like you needed to like know how transistors work to operate this? You could, and every single time we have this like leap of technology, people will make comments like that, right? Or have perspectives like that. But you have to understand in every one of those things what really matters. Like, because I'll actually go straight to this, like we push a lot of data around on the web today. Back 15, 20 years ago when I sort of started, 15 years, when I started a lot of this, and there's a lot of that big data, you had to really understand what was going on there. If you work with a tool that provides that type of function, you have to understand it. But generally speaking, that's been abstracted away, and I actually think that's a beautiful thing. Like you don't have to deal with a lot of those problems that you didn't have to deal with a lot of those problems anymore. You deal with things that are closer to people, to the user, and the value that you really want to create. And so like content generation here is like, you can choose what to accept into like a system of record. You can it should entirely be up to the user what they want. Like the natural use is like, hey, like the AI is not going to go on vacation for you. Like you can ask it for whatever you want, but you're the one who goes on vacation for the trip itinerary. So it's entirely up to you. How much, like if you enjoy planning, looking for those, like that restaurant, that one activity, great. But you're the one who goes on it. And so if you get a recommendation, then like you just go on it. And on some level, there's a point that you're making around like, hey, if you hadn't gone through any of those things before, how would you know that that's what you want? Right? Like but at the same time, if you use these things enough, if you understand sort of the input, like operating at that level of, hey, what's the experience that I want, rather than how do I tease out, like, in the US we use Yelp, right? But like in Japan there's Tabelog, or like there's like, you don't care about that anymore, right? Like you just want to say, hey, I like this type of food, or I want to be adventurous. Like there's things that end up getting abstracted away because they're details that don't really matter. Which site you use, how do you fill out like certain types, how do you navigate certain like corners of the internet? You don't care about that. And so you just focus on going on vacation. And then you can work with the system to update it for the next time. And so, like, again, you're moving up the different level of abstraction here. And so, I don't know if that ended up making sense, but
No, I'm curious how that fits into your role, because you're obviously SVP of AI and product.
Mhm.
And the way you're describing this is that the problems that we used to solve compared to the problems we're solving now have kind of moved from
Oh, yeah.
more technical, having to get down in the weeds, to very much just a product focus. Can we understand value and have taste
Yeah.
to understand
So-
what value is?
Yeah, so it actually has a massive impact. And so, like, companies like an AuditBoard, their product development teams have to go through a fundamental transformation. So pre-AI, sure, like this, or even the standard today, if I'm honest, is that we need to understand users in the tasks, the high-level tasks that they do. What I mean by that is like, what's the form that they need? Do I care about what's in that form? Like a work day, right? Like, or sort of some job site. You need to know, like, oh, a job has a title, it has a location, it may have a description, may have a pay band, but you don't care what that is. Like, like you can call the CEO, like the business title for the CEO could be clown. You don't care. The user fills that out. Now, though, the starting point is not that empty or blank. It's not that blank page on the empty form. Now it is that filled out content for a user to go do something. And in your understanding as a software vendor, as a product development team of the end user, needs to dramatically up level. Like you cannot just say, in product management, they're like, oh, a user should be able to send out a notification. Now it's like a user, like here are the 15 types of notifications with the types of content in different types of situations that you really need to have an understanding of. And so going back to like, hey, AI product development, where I said earlier, like the name of the game is more and more evals. Evals is, you log on to, actually, let me take a step back here just to make this more vivid. For everyone that's used enterprise software, Workflows, AuditBoard, Oracle, anyone, the thing in all marketing pages is they just show the dashboards. And the reason why they show the dashboards, because everything else is really boring. It's just like it is. It's very functional. It's really valuable because it allows you to do so many things, but it's really boring. There's no marketing pizzazz. It's not Instagram. It's so but now I actually think the world is very different. You have to provide people pre-filled content for them to review. Again, you cannot do that if you don't know what they are trying to do and more about who they are. So you got to spend more time understanding the organization, the broader workflow, the broader tool chain that they live in, and really have like a massively greater degree of empathy for users.
Let me take that even one step back,
Hmm.
and I can cut this out of the podcast if you
Yeah.
want, but I want to try paint a picture
Yeah.
to make it more vivid. We
Yeah.
were speaking before the call, and you told me you've just got a 1-year-old.
Hmm.
18 years from now, what skills do you want your kid to have as they're graduating high school? How should they think about the world to be successful in this new year?
I think about this. I don't have an. I don't have an answer that's sort of like very clean and crisp. Um, I think about it in terms of bets and sort of like beliefs and realities. And the bet I would make, well, sort of one reality that I have belief in is that humans matter. Like we live it, like, well, we are humans. We live on this planet, and all this great new things should help us live better lives. Be kinder to each other, have higher standards of living. So that's number one. Like, humans matter. Second is that I would not bet against human creativity. Like, we will find ways of doing things. Will everyone be happy with all the things that we, as a society, figure out or, like land on? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. But I would bet on human creativity. And human creativity and human aspirations to do more. So 100 years ago, Keynes, sort of British economist, like he was walking around the park as a, sort of in the aristocratic class and thinking about like, hey, if incomes go up some amount, people will work 3 hours a week or something like that. People work more now than they did that back then. But people also do a lot more things. The standard of living is so much greater. And so when I think about this is, directly to your question here, like 18 years from now, what will matter will be human values and what we want to do with our time and with our lives, what type of society we want to live in. And I think that question, whether she ends up wanting to be part of building something that helps some aspect of that, or she lives in society where, like, there's all kinds of plenty and we just think about what we really want. The question's still the same of what type of society do we want to live in, and given that, what role do we want to play? And then reality will hit us in the face, and then we'll figure it out. But yeah, I mean, because I that's what I really, really think, that humans are what matter. And as long as she has a sense of that, the values of the society she wants to live in, that will be that's the enduring question. I can't make predictions of whether or not there'll be sort of cheap robots for everybody, or there will be like, everyone will have effectively, by today's standards, $1 billion a day to do stuff. Well, I don't know, but I do know that humanity will be around, and like, that's what matters.
That idea, and I'm just going to take this because this is what interests me now.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of humanity matters.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's more or less obvious than it was 30 years ago, pre-technology that we know now?
I think it's more obvious, actually. I think it's more obvious. I think that people have different views of this. If you go back, and it's easy to go back, and say, oh, like the world culture peaked in the 1700s, because there was Bach and Beethoven and like, Titian and like that kind of stuff, right? But my favorite sets of statistics is the number of people that move out of extreme poverty, right? Like, not by Western standards, but by global standards. Like the standard of living of, people sort of doing, normal people around the world. Whether you're talking about access to clean water or the ability to have, eat better food and travel more, like in the Western countries. Like, I think I think that what ends up being challenging for some people, and uh, this is the professional question too, of like, as some of the stuff that most people no longer want to do, like, just gets automated away. Uh, what do you do? Like, what do you do with your time, right? Because and that opening up to everybody does cause some angst, because not it like progress is not equal, or has not been equal, unfortunately. And so like that does cause problems, but I do think that it's easier and cheaper now to travel around the world than it has ever been. And if that's an amazing thing. There are more people with access to clean water now than it's ever been. And so what does that mean? It means that we got to go figure out what we want. We got to go figure out what the next thing is, and I also think that's like a really exciting thing. And so yeah, maybe I'll sort of reframe my question a little bit and add, what's a skill set, or what's a trait I want my daughter to have in 18 years? Optimism. Because the trajectory of the world is more and more optimistic in my view.
I want to ask one last question on this line of questioning, and then I'll go one personal one, and then I'll finish off.
Yeah.
Following that trajectory 30 years forward, I'm really intrigued about the idea of AI governance. I think a lot of kind of governmental systems that we've got set up around the world, they are subject to human corruption and human behavior. Humans are naturally greedy, they're naturally incentivized to benefit themselves and their family.
Yeah.
What do you think about the idea of AI being involved in government and actually making the rules? Is that a potential future?
I mean, I think it will be, but I think the question behind your question is also like, it's if you I sense a bit of like AGI, sort of the artificial general intelligence, super intelligence type of AI. If you take that out for a second, like I think it's important to note that there are two forms of AI governance that are sort of today outside of that bigger existential humanity level question. It's risk. There's IP type risk or performance type risk that companies take on, and so like data leakage and things like that. That's part of AI governance today. But then if you look at the laws, it's really about human rights. And so like the EU AI Act has risk levels all encoded in terms of how it affects human beings, and so it's a very human centric view, right? Does this make hiring decisions? Does this make like death decisions? And so like companies really need to think about that again in terms of humanity and humans and their rights. And I think that will continue. Like those two types of risks will continue. Will continue to be there, and that like we need to grapple with, and then we'll do that. And then I actually think outside of stuff that gets written about, that will be the primary thing, especially as more and more tools will have it. Honestly, that's why AuditBoard acquired an AI governance tool, because no longer like you're moving outside of just say one team, and now like you have every team that needs to deal with it now, so you want a tool to help sort of companies as a whole manage it. The other part of like I would actually encourage folks to if you're interested in what will AI do or not do. I just think at the end of the day, AI needs to align to something, and that alignment should be to human values of whatever societal question. However, we land at the societal question of what kind of society we want to live in. And like I've always sort of thought about like so there's I'm going a little bit off the rails here, but like
I went off the rails about 25 minutes ago, so let's just continue.
So there's this notion of positive versus natural law, right? And and so this comes from Aquinas 800 years ago or something like that. And so the question is the thought exercise of is like, why do we have laws written down that tell someone do this, don't do this? Why not just have a panel of people that that just, you know, mete out justice or make judgment calls on justice case by case, right? Resolve, basically just like have a, whether it's in the set of individuals or panels of people or just, you know, individuals who just like make determinations in the Judge Dredd style, right? Of like, I am the law. I think that again the reason being is there's some level of consistency, predictability that humans want. And the reason why we have judges is that's not always a perfect system. I don't see a world of AI that's fundamentally different from that. Again, once you get to like real super intelligence and whatnot, I don't know. I do know that like AI runs on chips, and so like you can turn things off. And so like there are safeguards like that. But yeah, like I said, in the same way, how do we trust people? How do we trust AI? You know, like those are still eternal questions. Again, but they all come back to what kind of society do we want to live in? And is there a role for AI in part of that? I actually think absolutely. But as an independently not aligned to humanity type of entity, I mean that's up to us. I personally believe we shouldn't have that.
Interesting. My last question
Yeah.
is the same question that I ask every guest.
Mhm.
I've had every which answer.
Mhm.
I'm not going to provide any further context.
Yeah.
You just take it whatever way
Uh-huh.
you want to take it.
Yeah.
I encourage you to take 5 to 10 seconds before
Mhm.
answering as well.
Mhm.
Why do you do what you do?
Oh, that's easy. That's easy. Like what I do, so I like how the world works. I like understanding how the world works. And like a lot of that comes down to, you know, like these boring systems that make the world run. And so the example I actually like to use is running water. Um, I have the fortune of living in California, uh, and when I turn on the tap, I fill up a glass and I drink it, and then I don't think about it at all. That chain from the source of the water in the mountains all the way to that tap, it goes through so many different types of, you know, people, organizations, teams, processes, and there's a latent trust there somehow. But I turn it on and it just works. And so like, you know, complex global systems around distribution, distribution. Like that's why, if you look at my background, like I've worked in a lot of those types of things. Like get distribution of goods, product to people, to, you know, recruiting is a big part of my career, and so like how people show up in places and the processes that run in the background that enable that. I absolutely love that level of like just being part of that and understanding that, having visibility into that in the way that like not that is not stuff that you just read about in articles. It's just like this is how things actually work, whether it's at a technical level or at a system level. Uh, I just love how the world works. And I think the world's an absolutely fascinating and amazing place. And the human elements of it, even more so. Like the human systems, again, designed or organic, I guess they're just fascinating.
Anton, I want to firstly thank you for your time. And two, if people want to learn maybe more about you or what you do, how would they go about getting in contact?
Well, get in contact. I think the best place is to go on LinkedIn and look at my profile. My name's pretty straightforward. It's probably me and a Danish furniture designer. And so, like, I think if you've seen this podcast, it should be pretty obvious, you know, which profile is mine.
Okay, amazing. I appreciate your time, Anton.
No, thank you so much. I had a blast chatting with you.